As your Democratic nominee and a person who prides himself on citizenship and awareness, I ask that you take a good look at my U.S. Hope campaign, found on broadcast on YouTube with the American flag. I also ask that we take a closer look here in the state of Ohio, in Warren County, at why this program hasn't been instituted by some of the religious community, some of the schools, and some of the athletic departments. Because all we're really asking you to do is be accountable, to sell two versions of one book that I wrote called A Bridge of Hope about how to be mannered, how to appreciate, and how to use crowdfunding to raise money for things like medical research when it comes to ALS, cancer, and other diseases, as well as provide information to help people find their way out of despair in troubled times. During this investigation into U.S. for Hope and why it hasn't been instituted, I ask you to take a close look at leadership. And by leadership, around here, it gets no higher than Senator Steve Wilson from the 7th District and our Congressman, Greg Lansman. They need to be more assertive when it comes to things like objective ways to heal communities from things that linger from our past. With that said, I believe that we need to focus quite a bit on our Latin American community, something that was brought up in a very divisive manner by Trump's biggest supporter here in Butler County, in Richard Jones. Richard Jones asked for Latinos who have trouble with communications to not spend their money in his county, something that is against any type of business common sense that I've ever had. We would be better off to try to learn from each other than to build walls because of communication barriers. Can you imagine if we would have took that approach as Native Americans when the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria came? We would have said, no, we will not help you. And eventually, they would have left. It's counterproductive to a melting pot society like we have here in the United States, where we have every type of individual that is an ingredient to the overall beautiful peoples in the United States of America. Our government has focused quite a bit on energy, and the head of the Energy Commission, Mr. Steve Wilson, out of Lebanon, Ohio, carries quite a bit of weight when it comes to the legislation that gets introduced as far as being favorable or not favorable to places like British Petroleum and Marathon Oil. So I can't help but notice how many times my phone rings and I talk to someone who is obviously from the Middle East or Indonesia and wonder why it is that we aren't investing the money and investing the time to have these businesses develop more with our southern neighbors in Latin America. These are the type of jobs that can build communities in Latin America to sustain a population and also to create that capitalist concept that is so desperately needed in Latin America. And in turn, it could help our immigration problem, like Bill Clinton designed with NAFTA. And I know that I've discussed some of the flaws before with NAFTA. And what the flaws are is a total disregard for the humanities when it comes to these companies like General Motors and Ford. When they get to Mexico and pay pennies on the dollar to their automotive workers who are not represented by a union and disregard all regulations when it comes to things like worker safety, environmental issues, and things such as that. Taking all the money that they spend on these things in America off the ledges and creating enormous profitability. But instead of sharing that profitability with people who may not be able to afford cars in Europe and in America, they keep it. And you can see the profiteers go down there and screw up a perfectly good plan to fight immigration because of greed. Instead of using their platform as businesses to reach, teach these people and change the way they see themselves as a society. Something that was eloquently discussed by Bill Gates when it came to the big red scare versus Microsoft in the 80s and 90s. As he tried to develop software and be able to distribute it in Beijing, but found that the cultures were different there and they weren't conducive to him providing incentive for them to choose. So what he did was he invested over the next 20 years into marketing campaigns like the U.S. for Hope template in China to try to help them to understand what it means to be an entrepreneur, what it means to have ingenuity, and how different our economies are set up so that they can see for themselves that a communist economy treats you based on your collective buying power instead of your unique qualities that you can add, like it does in a capitalistic society, allowing a person to achieve great things and be supported by the government. And when we look at our Mexican friends and our Latin American friends, most of the time it ends up being an imperialist community where certain families have all the land, all the money, and all the agriculture tied up so that the rest of the population has to purchase or provide work and barter for their products. And it causes more of a issue when it comes to human rights and civil issues. So we have to take small steps to change cultures. And I think that with the assistance of the United Nations, we can do this in Latin America, just as they can do it in Europe with certain factions of new societies that have formed since the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And we can start to focus on bringing the world together under the United Nations with one currency, which would be electronic funds transfer. And we can stop the underworld from manipulating and living as a sub-economy, undermining everything that we're trying to do as a democracy. By making all people's taxes accountable and taking away the same percentage from all of society instead of just putting it on the back of the middle class, which has been destroyed and eroded in this country. We have to look at changing things like Senator Steve Wilson, I'm sure, will agree, when it comes to our dependence on OPEC and some of these countries in Saudi Arabia and Yemen and different places who have such an impact on OPEC as to dictate things in America through favorable pricing. We can control things on our continent once we start to move away from our dependence on foreign oil and create new energy here in this country, as well as curb consumption by using legislation and using our positions in government to force people out of these high horsepower energy monsters as vehicles and placing them more in the three-cylinder and smaller engines, electric engines, and things that we can start to rebuild our environment with by choosing the less damaging options as a nation because of legislation, making things like the smaller vehicles much cheaper, and even using some of our Latin American friends to help achieve this goal, and having the SUVs and the big trucks prices raised quite a bit to curb the buying of these damaging combustible engines that are guzzling these foreign fuels, and move us into a direction of helping our continent and helping our world at the same time. I also think that the accountability issue here in Ohio, especially in Warren County, is something that comes into question. As I have seen with my own eyes, memorials that have went up for people who have contributed to society. But at the same time, I've seen people dismiss some other aspects of the things that they have done and achieved when it comes to saving grace, if you will, and ignoring some of the issues that could develop quickly if given the right amount of time by some of the media globally. And with that said, I think that we need to focus on the U.S. for Hope campaign in our schools, and we need to use our churches more, just as I have pointed out in the Mothers of Mercy 3.2 Act that I put together for the young struggling families to receive support from the state of Ohio and federal government and the citizens who are able to help them develop into stronger Ohioans. I hope that these messages are able to carry on by being spread by people who come across them on YouTube and broadcast with the American flag, and that we can see a movement develop in this country to a more unified citizenship-based nation. I want to thank you for your time, and I do ask that you share my Mothers of Mercy and U.S. for Hope campaigns, especially with the Olympics.